I don't know if any of you have ever been in a situation where literally everything seems controlled, perfect, as if nothing could go wrong, and out of nowhere the ground disappears. The story I'm going to tell here is about a guy named Arthur. And look, he wasn't just anyone. Owner of a business empire, famous among entrepreneurs and influencers, a millionaire with houses in several capitals, and a collection of cars that would make any speed enthusiast drool. At 45, Arthur was seen as the kind of man who had already won in life. He had status, money, prestige, and a woman who, in everyone's eyes, was perfect. But all of this crumbled on an ordinary Friday night when he decided to drive back from the office alone in the silence of his favorite car, a brand new, black imported model with darkened windows. The radio was off, the city practically empty, and the only sound was the engine purring on the expressway that connected the center to the luxury condominium where he lived. Arthur liked these moments of silence, especially when he needed to clear his mind. But that day, the silence turned into a scream. A high beam burst into his eyes coming from the opposite direction, and a second later, a car threw his against the wall. It was dry, brutal. He didn't even have time to understand. The crash crushed the front of the car, the airbag exploded, and everything went dark. While his body was crushed between the steering wheel and the seat, the only name that hammered in, his head was Clara. Clara was the type of woman who attracted attention wherever she went. Beautiful, elegant, articulate. Anyone who saw her from the outside thought she was the perfect partner for Arthur. But behind the scenes, things had been different for a while. She was cold, distant, with that look of someone who is no longer there, And no matter how much he tried to ignore it, it bothered him. At the hospital, after the accident, she arrived in tears, screaming his name as if she had lost the world. She knelt on the reception floor, hugged the doctor, begged for news. It looked like a scene from a movie, but what no one saw was the other side. Arthur was taken straight to the ICU in an induced coma. The condition was serious. Trauma, fractures, risk of never waking up again. And that's when a fundamental person entered this story. Gabriella, the nurse on the night shift. Discreet, professional, but very observant. She began to notice that Clara's gestures didn't match what her eyes said. A smile here, a tear there, but her gaze was empty, icy. And from time to time, when she thought she was alone, Clara said strange things near Arthur's ear, like, "You were so smart, but you fell for it perfectly." Gabriella had no way of proving it, but she felt that tightness in her stomach that only those who deal with life and death every day know how to interpret. Clara controlled everything. Doctors, schedules, visits, exams. She said it was out of love, but it seemed more like control than care. And while at the hospital, she pretended to be the devoted wife. At home, the story was different. Nights of discreet parties, long calls with a guy named Vinicius. Clara was living a double life, and Arthur, trapped in a comatose body, still had no idea. The truth is that Clara wasn't just waiting for her husband to die. She was counting on it. And Gabriella, even without concrete evidence, began to put the pieces of this whole story together like someone assembling a puzzle without knowing the final image. Each loose phrase, each suspicious gesture, became a silent alarm in her head. And it was on a random afternoon, one of those when the hospital is quieter than usual, that Gabriella heard something she could no longer ignore. Clara, thinking she was alone in the room with Arthur, said in a low but firm tone on the phone, "Don't worry, my love. He won't wake up again." That froze Gabriella. The sentence was not said with pain nor despair. It was said with conviction, for sure. The nurse left the corridor without being seen and spent the rest of the day reliving those words in her head. She thought about telling someone, but who would believe her? Who would take a suspicion based on a sentence said in the corridor seriously? What if she had misunderstood? But inside she knew. She knew there was something very wrong there. And that's when she started watching more closely. Clara became the center of Gabriella's attention without even realizing it. Each visit was observed, each call, each forced smile. It was only a matter of time before the pieces started to fit together. Vinicius, the so-called my love on the other end of the line, was an even more mysterious figure. Gabriella had never heard this name until she started paying attention to Clara's conversations. He didn't appear at the hospital, wasn't a relative, wasn't a friend, but from the tone of the conversations, he was someone very intimate. And the strangest thing, no one in Arthur's family knew this Vinicius. He wasn't on Clara's social media, didn't attend events, wasn't seen at parties, but he was present, always present. Clara spoke to him secretly, in the car, in the hospital bathroom, at home at night. She smiled on the phone in a way she never smiled at Arthur. It was an intense relationship, one of those dangerous ones, full of promises and demands. Gabriella heard his name for the first time when Clara was in the hallway, near the emergency stairs, thinking no one was listening. "Vinicius, I already said I'm going to solve it, but I'm not going to do it alone." The nurse was sure that man was more than a lover. He was part of the plan. Clara's plan wasn't just to live a forbidden love. It was to get rid of Arthur. But what she didn't count on was someone listening to everything, and that someone would have the courage to act. Every day, Gabriella became more certain that Clara was counting on Arthur's death as if it were a planned stage. And it wasn't just an emotional suspicion, it was almost a logical puzzle. Clara was always one step ahead. She arrived early at the hospital with excuses of dedication, carrying bags full of items for her husband: natural juice, magazines, an old coat. She made a point of entering the room alone, locking the door from the inside, something that wasn't common in the ICU, and staying there for long minutes, in silence, sometimes speaking too softly. And when she left, it was as if she had performed a play: red eyes, dejected face, and a post ready for social media. A photo holding Arthur's hand with the caption, "I'm still waiting for you." It was such a performance that Gabriella began to think she was in a soap opera. But she knew it was all real and that this little theater hid something much more dangerous. At home, Clara lived another life. She spent hours on her cell phone, made expensive purchases, went to discreet parties in the condominium, and spoke with Vinicius at strategic times. The relationship between the two was intense, almost obsessive. And what bothered Gabriella the most was the certainty in Clara's voice when she spoke of him. It was as if everything was already resolved, as if Arthur was already out of the way. In one of these calls, Clara even asked a doctor in a gentle voice if it wasn't more humane to let Arthur rest. Gabriella swallowed hard. It wasn't concern. It was a disguised request, a request to kill. And the more she listened, the more she understood. Clara was putting together a script for a tragic ending, but she still didn't know that someone was writing down every act of this play. That's when Gabriella started recording. She wrote everything down in a notebook hidden inside the lab coat closet. Loose phrases, visiting hours, changes in Clara's behavior, anything that seemed out of the ordinary. And the list only grew. One day, Clara locked the room and spent almost half an hour inside with her cell phone, to her ear, speaking softly. Gabriella stayed outside, close enough to pick up parts of the conversation. "He has no reaction at all," Clara said. "I already spoke with Gustavo. He said that as soon as there is a brain death report, we can file for probate." That wasn't just a scare, it was a confirmation. Gustavo was the new name that entered the board. A doctor. And if a doctor was involved with Clara and this Vinicius, then things had escalated. Now it wasn't just betrayal, it was conspiracy. Gabriella started observing Gustavo too. He had reappeared at the hospital after some time away, claiming family health problems. But right on the first visit to Arthur's room, something didn't add up. He spoke to Arthur as if he expected a reaction. "Still there, big guy?" he said, fiddling with the equipment. It was as if he was testing something. Later, she discovered that he had been seen talking for long minutes with Clara in the hallway, laughing together, almost intimate. Gabriella became, alert. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a connection, and too much connection, in that context, was danger. It was only when she caught Clara getting into Gustavo's car, in the dark hospital parking lot, that everything became clear. They were together. They had a plan. And Arthur, even in a coma, was at the center of it. But what no one counted on was that he was coming back. Very slowly, but coming back. And Gabriella was the only one who knew. The first time Arthur moved his fingers was subtle, almost imperceptible. Gabriella was on the night shift as usual, checking his vital signs and cleaning his face with a damp towel. It was a holiday. The hospital was quieter than usual, and Clara hadn't shown up that day. When she gently squeezed the cuff to measure his blood pressure, she felt a slight tremor in his arm. She stopped. She thought it might be her imagination. She repeated the gesture. Another movement, discreet, but real. Gabriella's eyes widened. She took the flashlight and shone it directly into his pupils, and there, for the first time in weeks, the pupil reacted. It was little, but it was enough. Her heart raced. She held his hand and whispered, "Arthur, if you can hear me, blink. Try to move your hand." And he blinked, slowly, with effort, but he blinked. His eyes were red, heavy, as if he were waking up from a nightmare that had lasted too long. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. He couldn't speak. His throat was dry, but he was breathing more, consciously. Gabriella wet a gauze and dabbed it on his lips, explaining everything in a low voice. "Calm down. You're alive. You're in the hospital. You had an accident, and I'm here. Everything will be okay." Arthur closed his eyes again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a coma. It was exhaustion. He was awake, and now Gabriella needed to make one of the most important decisions of her life. Tell the medical team and expose everything at once, or keep that secret until she understood what was really happening around him. It wasn't an easy choice, but when she remembered the phrase she heard from Clara, "If he wakes up, I'm screwed," she knew what she needed to do. Keeping it a secret was his only chance of survival. In the days that followed, Gabriella and Arthur created a simple communication system. One finger raised meant yes, two fingers no. It was what they had, and it worked. Arthur still couldn't speak, but he was becoming more and more present. His gaze became firmer, his breathing more stable. His mind was working, absorbing everything, and Gabriella didn't waste any time. She began to tell him, little by little, everything she had seen, heard, and suspected in recent weeks. Clara's conversations with this Vinicius, the phrases said in the darkness of the room, the suspicious behavior of the doctor Gustavo, the hidden calls, Clara's attempt to induce the doctors to turn off the machines. Each word was a stab to Arthur, even without being able to speak. His body reacted. A muscle that trembled, a stronger sigh. The pain wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was the pain of discovering that the woman he loved was on the other side, that she was trying to erase him from life, not with anger, but with coldness, and worst of all, methodically. When Gabriella said the name Vinicius for the first time, Arthur's eyes flashed with anger. He had never heard of this man. Never. But now this name seemed to be in every part of the story. He was the center of the conspiracy. Gabriella held his hand and said, "I don't have evidence to take to the police. Not yet. Only what I saw and heard. But I'm going to take care of you. We're going to get out of this. But you need to promise me that you'll keep pretending." And he promised with one finger. It was at that moment that they stopped being patient and nurse. They became allies, and they knew they only had one chance, because if Clara found out that Arthur was awake, she wouldn't hesitate. She would try again. Only this time, Gabriella would be ready. Arthur woke up a little more each day, not just in body, but in soul. The information Gabriella brought was like reality shocks. Each revelation dismantled a piece of what he thought was his life. The woman who slept next to him, who shared his achievements, his travels, his fears, was now the same one who was plotting his end. And this Vinicius, that name became a ghost, an invader in his house, in his bed, in the life plans he built himself. Gabriella did her best to dose how much she told him each shift. She knew his emotional state was as fragile as his body, but Arthur wanted to know. He needed to put the pieces together. He was the one who, with effort, signaled for her to bring the man's full name. Gabriella replied bluntly, "Vinicius Duarte, young, tattooed, lives on appearances, says he's a businessman, but no one knows what he does. Lives in rented apartments, changes cars every month, lives at someone's expense, and that someone is your wife." Arthur's head was spinning. He felt the pulse in the back of his eyes, but he also felt something being born there, a new, different strength. He knew Clara was ambitious, vain, difficult, but he didn't know she was capable of so much. And now he knew. Trust had turned into war, and he wasn't going to lose. Gabriella warned, "You need to recover energy, Arthur. Strength. The time to act will come." And he only replied with one finger, "Yes." When Gabriella left the room that day, She carefully locked the door and stood still for a few seconds outside. She was no longer just a nurse taking care of a patient. She was a woman trying to prevent a murder, and the only person in the hospital who knew Arthur was back. As the days went by, Gabriella began to act more strategically. She changed visiting hours, rearranged shifts, and personally took care of everything involving Arthur. She spent more time in his room than anywhere else, and it was there that she had the idea to look for his trusted lawyer. Arthur signaled positively as soon as he heard the name, Alvaro. Gabriella understood the urgency and decided to act with maximum discretion. She used an old public telephone, forgotten in a corridor near the employees' break room. She called Alvaro and explained the basics. Arthur woke up. Can't tell anyone. He needs to talk to you. It's serious. It's about his life. Alvaro hesitated. He found it strange, but agreed. They arranged the visit for the next day, disguised as if he were just a relative coming to visit. Gabriella prepared everything, and when the lawyer entered the room and saw Arthur with his eyes open, he almost dropped his briefcase. The shock was visible. Arthur, still weak, looked at him and said with a scratchy voice, "We have work." The plan started there. Arthur dictated the orders. First, change the will. Clara would be removed from any inheritance or legal power over the assets. Then, start an investigation into financial transactions in Vinicius's or her name. He wanted to know if he was being robbed. And more, he demanded a new, secure cell phone without traces that only he and Gabriella knew about. She bought it downtown, paid in cash, and hid it inside a bread bag to enter the hospital. Arthur kept the device in the bedside table drawer, under medical pamphlets. The war had begun, and he was no longer the victim who entered there unconscious. Now he was the one who had the advantage. He just needed to keep quiet for a few more days, because soon everything was going to turn around. With each step, Arthur took in reconstructing his own story. The clearer the dimension of the trap he had fallen into became. And the most infuriating thing was that all of this was being executed with surgical coldness inside a hospital, with the help of professionals who had access to everything. Clara continued with her impeccable act. She arrived made up, well-dressed, distributing smiles to nurses and doctors. She brought flowers, posted photos holding his hand, received praise on social media for being a warrior wife who doesn't abandon her husband. But behind this performance, she already knew that something was getting out of control. The plan was falling behind. Vinicius was demanding. And now, Gustavo, the doctor involved with her, began to act more directly. He appeared in Arthur's room at strange hours, without warning, always with that overly light, almost mocking tone. He asked questions as if testing something. "Still here, champ?" Or, "Haven't given up yet, huh?" Gabriella recorded everything, every word, every expression. And when she realized that Gustavo was trying to apply a new dose of sedative without a prescription, it finally clicked. She grabbed the syringe from his hands, looked him in the eye and said, "This will be analyzed, and you will have to explain." At the same moment, 2 security guards entered the room, accompanied by Alvaro, the lawyer. The scene was filmed. Gustavo tried to leave, denied it, shouted, but was restrained. Arthur opened his eyes at that moment and said, with a voice still weak but firm, "You were wrong to underestimate me." That dismantled any argument. Gustavo was taken away. Clara didn't know it yet, but the structure she had built was crumbling, and what was to follow was just the beginning. Arthur had not only woken up, he had returned with a thirst for justice, and now it was personal. 2 days after Gustavo's downfall, the atmosphere in the hospital was one of muffled tension. Officially, the doctor had been suspended for suspicious conduct, but behind the scenes, everyone knew that something much bigger had happened. Nurses whispered in the corridors. Doctors avoided commenting. Employees looked away when they crossed paths with Gabriella or Arthur. But the truth is that no one had the courage to ask. Meanwhile, Clara continued to act as if nothing had changed. She thought that the promised fix by Gustavo had already been done, that in a few days the inventory would be underway, and she would be free to live her dream with Vinicius. But she didn't know that Arthur was fully conscious and ahead of every move. Gabriella became even more alert. She locked the room from the inside. She slept with her cell phone in her hand. Any visit was recorded, and it was at this moment that Arthur made a new request. He needed to review his will urgently. Alvaro appeared the next day with a thick envelope full of documents. Arthur, now firmer, sat down with Gabriella's help, took the pen with his hand still trembling, but determined, and signed. Clara was officially out of everything, without rights, without access, without decision-making power. The will now named a distant cousin as the direct responsible party, someone trustworthy, someone Clara didn't even know. In addition, new clauses were added. Any suspicious activity in the event of the holder's death would lead to a complete financial audit. It was the first time Arthur felt he was regaining control of his own life. Gabriella, by his side, watched in silence, with pride. And that's when Arthur asked for something no one expected. "I want her to know, in front of everyone. I want to see her face when she finds out she lost." It was the beginning of the turnaround, and this time Clara wasn't going to escape. The plan to expose Clara was set up with surgical precision. Alvaro, the lawyer, contacted her as if nothing had happened. He sent a message saying he needed to talk in person about the details of Arthur's will, and that she should go to the hospital the next day at 2 p.m. to resolve the legal issues. Clara replied in 2 minutes, with that tone of someone who was already counting the zeros in her bank account. She said she would go. For sure. The next day arrived, and with it, the perfect stage. Gabriella helped Arthur take a bath, shave, and change out of his gown into light, clean clothes. He wanted to be awake, really awake, when she came in. He wanted to look her in the eye and see her reaction. The shock, the fear, the shame. Gabriella tidied up the room carefully. Nothing extravagant, just enough to look like a normal environment. The heart monitor silent, natural light coming in, documents organized on the table. At 1:45 p.m., Clara appeared at the reception desk. Tight dress, high heels, hair brushed, and the same makeup as always. She greeted the staff with that rehearsed, little smile, as if everything were under control. Alvaro and Gabriella received her formally. They took her to a private room where there was already an administration employee sitting in a corner as if she were just another piece of protocol. Clara sat down confidently. Alvaro opened the documents calmly and handed her a sheet. "Here is the updated version of the will, all officially registered yesterday." Clara took the sheet without suspecting anything and began to read with the same smile. But as the words sank in, her face changed. Her forehead furrowed, her gaze hardened, her hand trembled. "This is wrong," she said. Alvaro replied dryly, "It isn't. It was updated with Arthur's own signature." The impact was immediate. Clara froze. Her eyes quickly scanned the lines of the document, as if looking for a loophole, an error, anything that would invalidate it. But it was all there, clear and official. She was no longer an heir to anything. She lost all legal rights. Alvaro remained firm, sitting in front of her. Gabriella, on the side, watched without blinking. The silence became heavy. "He can't have signed this. He's in a coma," she said, her voice failing for the first time. That's when Gabriella replied, looking her in the eye. "Not anymore." Clara turned slowly, confused, as if her brain couldn't process it. "What do you mean?" And Gabriella added, "Arthur is awake, since before Dr. Gustavo tried to kill him." The information exploded in the room like a silent grenade. Clara's eyes widened. For the first time, she completely lost control. She was speechless, without an argument. She tried to disguise it, but she couldn't anymore. Alvaro stood up slowly, took the document from her hand and said, "You lost, and you don't even know how much yet." Clara didn't answer. She got up from the chair, grabbed her purse, and left the room without saying a word. She walked quickly down the hall, as if running from something. But the truth was this. At that moment, everything she believed in, all the plans she had made with Vinicius, all the steps calculated with Gustavo, had turned to dust. But what no one expected was what would come next. Clara didn't leave to give up. She left to think, to recalculate, to try what was left, the last card, because someone like Clara didn't accept losing. She sat in the back seat of the car, turned the air conditioning on full blast, and stayed there for hours, staring at nothing, with dry eyes, but her mind racing. Arthur had won a battle, but the war was far from over. Night fell, and with it, Clara reappeared. No makeup, no heels, no rehearsed smile. For the first time since the accident, she seemed stripped of the character she had played for so long. But the eyes still shone, not with pain, nor with sadness. It was anger mixed with despair. She entered the hospital as if carrying a plan in her pocket. She went straight to the reception desk, said she needed to see Arthur. Urgently. "It's an emergency visit," she said, her voice trembling, but controlled. The receptionist hesitated, but Clara was still, officially, the wife. And with that, access was granted. What no one saw was Gabriella, watching everything on the security monitors, running down the corridor with her heart racing. She knew that Clara wasn't going to take this sitting down. She knew she had something hidden. She immediately called Arthur's secret cell phone, which was well hidden in the drawer. "She's coming, alone. Don't let her touch you." Arthur was already sitting, prepared, his face serious, his body still weak, but his mind completely alert. He knew she would come, and he knew that now, more than ever, she was dangerous. The door opened slowly. Clara entered and closed it behind her. She locked it. The room was dimly lit. Only the light from the crack in the corridor partially illuminated the room. She stood there for a few seconds, staring at him, as if she still couldn't believe she was seeing this. "So it was true? You really woke up?" Arthur didn't answer. He kept his gaze fixed, cold, without blinking. She took a step, then another. "You didn't tell me. You didn't even give me a chance to explain." The attempt at justification came soon after, like someone trying to save what is already on fire. Clara spoke softly, in the tone of voice she used when she wanted to convince. "Arthur, I know it seems horrible, okay? But you don't understand. I was suffocating. That life, the routine, it was all an appearance. You didn't see me anymore. You didn't touch me. I felt invisible." Arthur remained motionless, without looking away. Every word she said seemed to come from a script, a rehearsed text. At some point, she believed that this version of the story still worked. "I met Vinicius at a time when I was alone. He listened to me. He made me feel alive." She paused. "Yes, I thought about running away, about leaving everything, but I never really wanted to kill you." It was at this moment that Arthur moved his head slightly, in a dry gesture, almost an ironic laugh, but without sound. Clara noticed. She took 2 more steps, now close to the bed. "We can still fix this. You can reverse everything. I don't want the money, I swear. I just want to start over, to get out of here with dignity. You can give me that." And then, for the first time, Arthur spoke, his voice weak but sharp. "You had a choice. Several, and you chose to try to erase me." Clara stopped. Her expression changed. Regret left, despair entered. "So that's it? You're going to throw me in jail?" Arthur replied. "You threw yourself in alone." And it was at that moment that she made the move that confirmed everything he and Gabriella suspected. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a small, transparent bottle with a clear liquid. The label had been torn off. "If you think you're going to come out on top, you're wrong. I'm going to end this now." And that's when the real end began. When Clara advanced with the vial in her hand, Arthur didn't need to think. He pressed, hard, the hidden button next to the bed. A direct alarm to the infirmary installed days before on Gabriella's advice. The signal traveled silently through the corridors, activating the protocol that only she knew. Clara, completely consumed by the impulse, didn't notice anything. With the vial open, she tried to reach the IV drip, wanting to pour the contents into the tube. But the door was broken down before she could. Gabriella entered with 2 security guards. One of them grabbed Clara by the arm and pulled her forcefully back. The vial fell to the floor, and the liquid ran across the white floor like a liquid confession. Clara began to scream, thrashing, saying it was all a setup, that they were trying to frame her. "He set it all up. He did this to get revenge. It's a lie. He wants to destroy me." The screams echoed through the corridor, but no one believed her anymore. Not even she did. Gabriella bent down, picked up the vial with a cloth, and placed it inside a plastic bag as evidence. She handed it directly to Alvaro, who appeared seconds later with the police team. Everything had been foreseen. Clara was handcuffed right there in the middle of the hospital, crying, screaming, struggling. But it was too late. Arthur, still sitting, watched everything in silence. His eyes were fixed on her. There was no more anger on his face. There was something else. Firmness. When she met his gaze for the last time, she tried to appeal, but he replied calmly, "You did this all by yourself." Clara was taken away, escorted, still ranting. and when the elevator door closed behind her, the corridor returned to silence. Gabriella sat next to Arthur's bed. "It's over." He took a deep breath, still with his eyes on her, and replied, "Not yet. There's still the other one." Even with Clara arrested, Arthur couldn't rest. His mind was in constant alert, reviewing every piece of the story, looking for the missing piece. Because deep down, he knew there was something bigger, something that Clara might not even be fully aware of. And he was right. At the end of that afternoon, Alvaro returned to the hospital with a stack of papers in his hand and an even more serious face than usual. "We have a breakthrough on this Vinicius Duarte," he said, entering directly into the room. Arthur adjusted the pillow, signaling for him to continue. "The guy isn't who he claims to be. He presents himself as a businessman, but he has no registered company, nor a reliable professional history. He's moved cities 3 times in the last 5 years. And worse, he has a record of fraud, theft, and an old accusation of assault." Arthur listened to everything in silence, his eyes fixed. Alvaro paused. "But what comes next changes everything. His last name, Duarte, is the same as Gustavo's mother's." Arthur frowned. Alvaro continued. "We pulled the records. Gustavo's mother, before marrying, was called Vera Duarte, and Vinicius is registered as Vera's son, but the father is not listed. There's only a simple birth certificate." Silence filled the room. Gabriella, who was there, brought her hand to her mouth. Arthur's eyes glazed over. "They are father and son," he said, in a low voice, almost breathless. Alvaro nodded. "Everything indicates that, yes." That fell like a dry punch. The conspiracy, the attempted murder, Clara's involvement, everything gained a new dimension. The enemy wasn't just Vinicius. It wasn't just Clara. It was Gustavo, the doctor, the man who had access to his body, his history, his most vulnerable moment, and who planned everything from the beginning. The revelation landed like a bomb in the silent room. Arthur was silent for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling as if trying to put all the pieces together at once. The pain he felt upon discovering Clara's betrayal seemed small compared to the new truth that was unfolding. Gustavo wasn't just a doctor involved in a sordid plan. He was the mastermind behind everything. He was the father of his wife's lover. And worse, he was there, next to him, inside the hospital, with total access to medications, reports, and control of his life. "This all started before Clara," Arthur said, his voice hoarse but steady. Alvaro nodded, closing the folder slowly. "Yes, long before. We're still cross-referencing information, but it seems that Gustavo met Clara years ago. We don't know if it was by chance or intentional from the start, but it's very likely that he planted Clara in your life." Gabriella couldn't hide her shock. "You think it was all planned from the beginning?" she asked with a lump in her throat. Alvaro replied without hesitation. "Yes. Clara may have even truly fallen in love with Vinicius along the way, may have thought she was in control, but she was just a piece within a larger plan. The one who really wanted to destroy Arthur was Gustavo." Arthur felt his head throb, but it wasn't physical pain. It was the weight of the truth, a truth that had been building for years. He remembered something old, a detail buried in time. "Gustavo and I studied together, same college. He tried to open a clinic, asked for my support. I refused, said I didn't trust his methods. He was silent for a moment. He never spoke to me again after that. Now I understand why. Gustavo's resentment hadn't disappeared. It had turned into rage, into hatred. And the worst kind of hatred is the one that waits, that disguises itself, that builds paths to attack with precision. Arthur now saw everything with different eyes. Clara was the distraction, Vinicius the emotional bait, but Gustavo was the one who traced every line of this plan. He waited for the right moment, studied Arthur's routine, approached without being noticed. He used his own son as the main piece, and Clara as a puppet. When Gabriella heard this, she felt a chill. He studied. "You, Arthur," she said. "He knew how you thought, how you acted. He knew where to attack, and she was right. It was all strategic." Arthur took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on nothing. "The most absurd thing is that, until yesterday, I thought the worst pain was being betrayed by the person who sleeps next to you. But it's not. The worst pain is being hunted by someone you didn't even remember existed. Silence filled the room for a few seconds. Alvaro stood up. The delegate already has the, documents. With this family connection between Gustavo and Vinicius, the case is now being treated as organized crime. They will try to locate Vinicius immediately. He fled the city last night, as soon as he heard about Clara's arrest, but he left traces. Arthur nodded. He'll try to disappear. Gabriela approached, serious. You think Vinicius is the mastermind behind all this? Arthur replied without hesitation. No, he's just a puppet. The mastermind behind everything is Gustavo. And it was. At that moment that Arthur's expression changed. He was no longer just a victim, nor just someone seeking justice. He was now a man at war, and the war had only one rule. Whoever tried to destroy his life was going to feel what it was like to be on the other side. Arthur spent the rest of that day in silence, but it wasn't the silence of doubt, of paralysis. It was the silence of preparation. His head was spinning, reviewing old conversations, cross-referencing memories, trying to understand how far Gustavo's plan could have gone. He knew that now it was no longer a matter of survival. It was a matter of justice, of exposing everything, and above all, of looking into the eyes of those who almost erased his existence as if he were disposable. Gabriela, always by his side, respected that silence. She no longer saw a patient there. She saw a man who had been crushed emotionally, physically, psychologically, but who was now rising, even with his body still weakened. When Alvaro returned to the hospital in the late afternoon, Arthur went straight to the point. I want to see them both, together, Gustavo and Vinicius. I want to look them in the face. The lawyer's eyes widened. Arthur, you're still recovering. This isn't safe. It's not a request. It's a decision, he replied, and there was no more room for retreat. The delegate was called. A plan began to be put together in silence. They knew that Vinicius still maintained contact with a distant cousin, and it was through this cousin that they set the trap. A message was sent. It said that Vinicius could go to the abandoned warehouse where he used to store some old equipment, pick up the documents and money. The location was perfect. Isolated, deactivated industrial zone, no cameras. The police set up the scheme. No visible patrol cars. Infiltrated agents. Everything coordinated with precision. Arthur asked to be there. Gabriela arranged a simple outfit, put a cap and sunglasses on him. Alvaro would accompany him, and she, from inside the warehouse, disguised as the cousin's assistant, would be his eyes. It was more than a confrontation. It was the final reckoning, and no one knew how it would end. On the appointed day, Arthur got into the car with Gabriela's help. His muscles still complained with every movement, but what moved him now was not physical strength. It was something else. It was the kind of strength that is born when someone tries to erase you and you decide to come back with everything. He barely spoke on the way. Alvaro drove in silence, following the police coordinates on his cell phone. Their car stopped at a strategic point, about 50 meters from the entrance to the warehouse. Agents were positioned in hidden spots, ready to act. Gabriela was already inside, disguised, pretending to organize papers. A small radio attached to her pocket transmitted everything to the team. The warehouse was dark, smelled of rust and mold. There were old boxes stacked in the corners, vestiges of abandonment. The perfect place for those who think no one is watching. At 7:32 p.m., a black car stopped at the entrance. Two men got out. Vinicius in the front, Gustavo right behind. Gabriela saw from afar and discreetly warned on the radio, "They're coming in." Outside, Arthur received confirmation and got out of the car slowly. Each of his steps was like a response to the days he spent trapped in that bed, while the two thought they had won. Inside the warehouse, Vinicius walked restlessly, looking around. "Where's the cousin? He said he'd be here." Gustavo, calmer, replied, "He must be on his way. Don't worry." But Vinicius wasn't calm. He was sweating. He ran his hand over his face all the time. That's when the door opened slowly. Arthur entered, without haste, without fear. The sound of his boots hitting the cement floor echoed in the warehouse like a muffled thunder. Vinicius froze. Gustavo took a second longer to understand, but when he recognized the face, his body took a step back. And there, at that moment, the game changed forever. The silence that formed when Arthur appeared was unlike any other. It wasn't just astonishment, it was the sound of fear when he arrives unannounced. Vinicius's eyes widened, looking around like a cornered animal. Gustavo, on the other hand, tried to maintain his composure. He tried to calculate, to understand if this was real or a game. But Arthur didn't need to say much. His body, even still weakened, was firm. His eyes fixed. His presence filled the space. "You thought I was dead," he said, his voice slow, cutting. "You spent weeks trying to erase me, thinking you were ahead. But I heard everything. I saw everything. And now, it's your turn." Vinicius tried to take a step, stammered something, but was interrupted by the entrance of the police officers. The sound of boots and shouts of, "Nobody move," echoed through the walls of the warehouse. In seconds, the two were surrounded. Gustavo maintained a cold expression, but his hands trembled. Vinicius began to shout, "It was him! He was the one who planned everything. I was just obeying." Panic took over him. The mask fell. He pointed to his father like a rat that gives away the escape route at the first sign of pressure. Gustavo turned his face slowly, looked at his son, and said with contempt, "You are weaker than I thought." The exchange between the two was quick, cruel, and definitive. They were alone now. There were no more alliances, no plans, only the consequences. Gabriela watched everything from the side, her heart racing but her eyes fixed on Arthur, and he, firm, turned to the police officers and said, "They won't get out of here with excuses. They will leave with evidence." And then he pointed to Gustavo's backpack, left in a corner of the warehouse. "Search there." The backpack was opened right there, under the dim light of a police flashlight. Inside, documents, a laptop, 2 cell phones, and a brown leather agenda. Everything organized with an almost sickening precision. Each paper seemed to be in its proper place, as if Gustavo had made a point of maintaining control until the last second. But it was the agenda that caught the attention. In it, handwritten notes detailed financial transactions, dates of meetings with Clara and Vinicius, names of bank accounts in tax havens, and even the schedule of what he called the final phase. The proof was there, in writing. Gustavo didn't say a word. He just looked, standing still, like someone who knows the game is over, but doesn't allow himself to show weakness. Vinicius, on the contrary, begged, "I didn't know about this. I swear, he did everything. I just obeyed." The police didn't need to listen anymore. They had everything. And when the officers began to handcuff them, Arthur took a step forward. He was sweating, panting, but firm. He looked into Gustavo's eyes and said, with a calmness that was frightening, "You studied with me. You knew who I was. And yet you thought you could break me." Gustavo remained silent, but his pride bled. Arthur then turned to Vinicius. "And you were just a pawn thinking you were a king." Vinicius was crying. Literally. There was no more strength, no pose, no escape. The two were taken away by the police in silence. The sound of handcuffs, shuffling steps, and the van door closing marked the end of the hunt. Arthur stood for a few more seconds, feeling the weight lift off his back. Gabriela ran to him, held him before he fell, and there, in the middle of that dirty warehouse, he cried, but not from pain. He cried because, after everything, he was still alive. The return to the hospital was silent. Arthur, now physically and emotionally exhausted, leaned back in the car with his eyes closed, as if he could finally rest. Gabriela, beside him, held his hand firmly. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with everything they had experienced in recent weeks. They didn't exchange many words. On the way, they didn't need to. What was between them had already surpassed any formality. It wasn't just nurse and patient, nor ally and protected. It was something denser, born from chaos, from trust forged in the dark. Upon arriving at the hospital, he was taken back to his room. No press, no fanfare. The delegate asked for discretion until the investigation was officially released. The evidence was secure. Clara, Gustavo, and Vinicius would be formally charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, and procedural fraud. In the following days, Arthur dedicated himself to physical rehabilitation with a discipline that surprised even the doctors. He wanted to walk, speak firmly, recover his body with the same strength with which he rebuilt his soul. Gabriela accompanied each step. He didn't want another professional by his side, and no one questioned it. She was the one who knew every detail, every pause, every weakness he hid. One night, sitting side by side, he said in a low voice, "You saved my life." She smiled without answering, but he insisted, "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here. No one would have noticed. No one would have had the courage." She squeezed his hand and replied sincerely, "I only did what was right." And he added, "In a world where no one else does." The two were silent, looking out the window. Outside, the city went on, but inside, in that room, a story had ended, and a new, completely different one was about to begin. The months passed. Arthur's rehabilitation was slow but steady. With each step recovered, with each new movement, he remembered everything he lived through. Not as an open wound, but as a scar he made a point of carrying. He returned to work, little by little. He delegated functions, changed the structure of the company, removed old names that now caused him distrust. He no longer wanted to live surrounded by appearances. The experience had changed the way he saw everything. People, relationships, power. He no longer wanted to be the man who lived in mansions surrounded by flatterers. He wanted peace, truth. He chose to live in a smaller, more discreet house, away from the flashes and parties. Gabriella continued by his side, now outside the hospital. Their relationship evolved without haste, with the naturalness of those who had already faced death together. There were no promises, no rush, just presence. In the courts, the case against Clara, Gustavo, and Vinicius gained national attention. The media, which previously exalted Clara as the warrior wife, now published headlines about the anticipated widow. The three were convicted. Gustavo, with a greater sentence for being the mastermind. Clara, for complicity and attempted murder. Vinicius, for active participation and document fraud. None of them showed real regret, only panic in the face of exposure. Arthur did not attend the trial. He sent a letter which was read in plenary. The greatest punishment for those who try to destroy another is to watch that other rebuild themselves better than before. He was applauded standing, and he moved on, without needing to prove anything to anyone. One day, already out of the spotlight, he and Gabriella sat on a park bench. She looked at him and asked, "Do you still think about Clara?" He replied, looking at the sky, "I think about it, but not with pain. I think as someone who saw the end and chose to continue." After everything, what surprised Arthur the most was not the evil he faced, but the capacity for reconstruction he discovered in himself. For a long time, he was the kind of man who solved everything with money. A problem arose, he bought a solution, but when death knocked on the door, he realized that no amount in the world could protect someone from betrayal, envy, or greed. What saved his life was something that money can't buy, the attention of someone who cares. Gabriella didn't gain anything from it. She risked her job, her career, her own safety, and yet she stayed. Arthur learned to value these things: the silent presence, the daily care, the details. He started writing everything down, not with the intention of publishing, but as a way to record. He wanted to remember the signs he ignored, the words that sounded strange, the moments when he felt that something was wrong and preferred not to see. Writing became a type of cure, and when Gabriella read some excerpts, she said, "Other people need to know this." He thought for days until he decided to turn the account into a book. It wouldn't be a bestseller, nor a media scandal. It would be a warning, a story told like so many others that happen and no one sees. He launched the book with a simple name, Almost Silenced. It sold few copies, but the letters he received from readers were many. People saying they saw themselves in the story, that they noticed signs, that they woke up in time. And that's when Arthur understood. The true legacy was not the fortune he almost lost, nor the prestige he regained. It was the chance to touch other lives with his own, to make what almost killed him serve to save someone. Because in the end, pain only makes sense if it can become a warning. One day, long after everything had calmed down, Arthur and Gabriella decided to visit the site of the accident. It was a quiet road, lined with trees, where the sound of the wind mixed with that of cars in the distance. He walked with firm steps, although still slower than before. They stopped, exactly at the point where his car had been pushed against the wall. The track paint had marks of new paint, a sign that everything had been restored. But for him, It was as if the scars were still on the asphalt. Gabriella was silent beside him. There wasn't much to say. He watched for a few minutes, took a deep breath and said, "It was here that everything ended, and here it also began." She looked at him with affection and replied, "Not every new beginning needs to be happy, but it needs to be true." And he nodded. It was the last time they spoke about it directly. From then on, everything they built was based on the present, not the past. They lived without haste. They traveled. They visited simple places, small towns, where no one knew who he was. Arthur donated part of his fortune to social projects focused on public health, hospitals, training of nurses, emergency care units. He wanted to transform into life everything they tried to use against him. Gabriella dedicated herself to an NGO that supports women victims of emotional and psychological violence, and together, they discovered a new meaning for the word survivor. It wasn't just someone who survives physical death, but who chooses to continue even after they try to kill the soul. One day, sitting in the garden of their house, he held her hand and said, "Thank you for staying when I couldn't ask." And she replied, smiling, "You never needed to ask. I knew you would come back." And he came back. For her. For himself. Arthur, even after everything he had been through, never allowed himself to fall into the discourse of revenge. As much as he had reasons, and they were legitimate, he understood early on that the real answer was not to return the favor. It was to move forward with dignity, and that cost more than any act of revenge. He saw many curious people trying to get close when the story gained visibility, trying to extract something, become friends of the moment, use his experience as a springboard for their own ambitions. But he learned to recognize the look of those who just want to suck, that anxious glimmer disguised as empathy. He avoided interviews, refused invitations to TV shows, and when he received proposals to turn his story into a series or film, his answer was always the same. This is not fiction. He didn't want to glamorize the pain, nor turn the nightmare into entertainment. He preferred silence. The life he rebuilt with Gabriella was made of simple routines, of coffees in the late afternoon, of open books on the porch, of long conversations about everything and nothing. She became his haven, and he, hers. Still, from time to time, nightmares returned. Images of Clara standing next to the bed, the muffled sound of the car wheels against the concrete, Gustavo's empty expression as he held the syringe. On those nights, Gabriella held his hand until he came back. She didn't say anything. She just stayed. Arthur said that the hardest thing was not remembering what he had lived through. It was dealing with the emotional memory, the one that the body keeps even when the mind wants to forget. But he didn't run away from it. He faced it. He knew that was what kept him alive, because he didn't want to erase the past. He wanted to turn it into a bridge to the future they were building, a future where the truth, even if painful, was the only possible basis. Arthur's story didn't become an eternal headline. Like everything in the world, it was being swallowed up by new news, by the most recent scandals, by the fresh tragedies that society consumes in a hurry. And that relieved him. He never wanted to be a symbol of anything. He just wanted to have the right to continue. When the last hearings took place months later, the defendants were dejected. Clara, who was once seen as the perfect woman, was now just a shadow of what she tried to appear to be. Her hair tied up, her face expressionless, her eyes sunken. Gustavo didn't even look to the sides. And Vinicius, thin, trembling, could barely stand. The final sentence was read with everyone standing. The judge was firm. What was committed here was not just an attempted homicide. It was the attempt to erase an existence for interest. The court recognizes the value of the victim who resisted and condemns those involved as provided by law. Arthur was not present. He watched everything by video conference next to Gabriella at home. When the sentence was confirmed, he just lowered his head and closed his eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just took a deep breath, as if dropping the last weight he was still carrying. After that day, he never spoke about them again. He kept the folders, deleted the clippings, cleaned the files, not because he wanted to forget, but because he no longer needed to remember all the time. He had won, not in the sense of destroying the enemies, but in the sense of recovering his own story. The life they chose for him was not the one he accepted to live, and that, in the end, was what made him greater than any revenge. A man can lose everything, money, health, even the ground. But if he keeps his conscience clear and his heart firm, he can start over. And that's what Arthur did, with courage and truth. The days were getting lighter, not because the pain disappeared, but because it found its place. Gabriella said that some wounds don't heal. They settle in. They become part of us. And Arthur understood this more than anyone. He no longer woke up every day with anger or a thirst for justice. Now, he woke up with gratitude for being alive, for being able to choose how to live, for having someone by his side who didn't love him for his image or his fortune, but for who he was. Their conversations became a kind of ritual. Late afternoon, a cup of tea, bare feet on the porch. They talked about future plans, but also about the small events of the day. A curious news item, a forgotten memory, a smell of food that awakened something. Arthur began to value these fragments of life as if collecting gold. Gabriella's presence kept him centered. She in turn carried the same firm silence as always, but now with a more evident tenderness. She was no longer the nurse who fought for a patient. She was the woman who chose to be there even after the battle was over, and he knew it. One day, during a walk through a small town in the countryside, Arthur saw a small bookstore. He went in, walked between the shelves, and found, by chance, an old edition of a book he used to read with his father when he was a child. He bought it without thinking. That night he read the first chapter to Gabriella. His voice was still hoarse, but firm, and as he read, she watched him with serene eyes. It was as if the past, present, and future merged there, in that simple moment. There was no more urgency, no fear. There was only them, and the certainty that, even after everything, it was still possible to trust. In that new phase of life, Arthur no longer sought applause or recognition. All he wanted was peace, and he found it in the things that once seemed too small to matter. Waking up without rushing, preparing his own coffee, walking among trees, listening to music without thinking about meetings or contracts. He began to write more often, now not only about what he had lived, but about what he observed in the world. People too rushed to notice their own mistakes, relationships built on appearances, the collective fear of showing fragility. Gabriella read everything, reviewed the texts, gave suggestions, and sometimes she cried with what he wrote, because there was truth there. And truth, nowadays, is almost a form of resistance. Arthur also became closer to simple people, neighbors who had never heard of him, and who treated him with naturalness. One of them, an 80-year-old man named Raoul, became his walking companion. They exchanged stories, jokes, recipes. It was an unlikely friendship, but real, and those were the ones that made the most sense now. Arthur also created a small foundation with the money that was left over from the empire he once commanded. Nothing grandiose, just a space for welcoming and listening to victims of domestic and emotional violence. The institution was named after his mother, Donna Lucia. It was his way of giving back to the world what he received when he needed it most. Someone who would listen without judgment. And it was there, in that silent gesture, that Arthur realized that he had finally reached the other side. Not the side of easy victory, nor of oblivion, but the side of transformation, of the one who survives, but not only for himself, who returns to life with purpose, and who understands, deep down, that the greatest form of justice is to live well, even when everything tried to prevent it. Over time, Arthur's story dissolved into everyday life, as all great stories eventually do. But he didn't mind. The absence of curious glances, insistent journalists, or people trying to extract a piece of advice for overcoming adversity was, for him, a blessing. What he lived through didn't need to be celebrated. It just needed to be lived, and now, overcome. One day during an interview he agreed to give only because it would be used for an educational documentary about emotional abuse. He was asked, if you could go back in time, would you change anything? Arthur was silent for a few seconds. He thought about everything. Clara, Gustavo, Vinicius. He thought about the days he almost died, the nights he spent in silence pretending to still be in a coma. And he replied with serenity, I would change the way I disconnected from people, how I stopped looking in their eyes, listening attentively. The rest was inevitable. The reporter, visibly touched, simply nodded, because in that answer there was more than reflection. There was maturity. After that, Arthur and Gabriella traveled abroad for a few weeks. They visited villages in Italy, ancient cities in Greece, isolated beaches in Portugal. They met people who lived with little but with much, with presence, with meaning. These trips served as a silent cure. It wasn't an escape. It was connection. One of those nights, in a simple inn in Santorini, Arthur looked at the dark sea and said, "Today I understand that true love doesn't come to fill voids, but to illuminate what already exists. You didn't save me, Gabriella. You just reminded me of who I was." She didn't respond with words. She just rested her head on his shoulder. And in that calm, in that silent darkness of the island, they sealed a new cycle, not of endings, but of belonging. Arthur never wanted to know about the past beyond what he had already lived, understood, and overcome. He didn't look for news about Clara, nor about the prison outcome of Gustavo or Vinicius. For him, that was no longer part of the narrative he wanted to feed. They ceased to exist the day I chose to. "Continue without hatred," he said. And that choice was daily. It didn't mean forgetting. It meant not giving more power to what almost destroyed him. Gabriella understood this viscerally. Both carried marks, but instead of hiding them, they learned to walk with them in sight. One day during a lecture Arthur was invited to give at a university. A student asked, "Do you think pain is necessary for us to evolve?" Arthur thought, looked at the young people in front of him, and replied, "Pain is not necessary, but it teaches what comfort doesn't show, and we only grow when we decide to learn from it." The room fell silent, not out of shock, but out of respect. That wasn't a catchphrase. It was experience. And it was there that Arthur understood that perhaps what most marked his trajectory was not the fact that he had survived, but the way he survived, without turning pain into bitterness, without repeating the cycle that almost killed him. At the end of the lecture, he left through the side door, avoiding forced greetings. He just wanted to go home. When he entered, Gabriella was in the backyard, taking care of the plants. He watched her for a few seconds without her noticing, and he thought, "That's what I almost lost, the chance to live with truth." He approached her, hugged her from behind, and said, "You are the best part of my story." She smiled, holding his hands, and at that moment, the past was silent for good. Over time, Arthur and Gabriella found a routine that didn't feel, like one. It was light, silent, made of small gestures that said more than any grand plan. There were no exaggerated promises, nor any need to prove anything to each other, just mutual care, an almost sacred respect for each other's time, for the pains each carried, and for the spaces they needed to maintain. In a world accustomed to running over everything in the name of speed, they chose slowness. They chose to wake up with the sun coming through the window without an alarm clock, make their own bread, walk aimlessly, sit and read without haste, and above all, listen. Because in the end, that's what saved Arthur. Someone listened to him when he couldn't scream. And now, he made a point of listening to the world around him. He became an observant man, more sensitive, less impulsive. Every now and then, he wrote letters to people he would never meet, leaving them in cafes, park benches, bus stops. Letters with phrases like, "You are stronger than you think," or "Pain does not define you." He didn't expect answers. It was his way of giving back what he had received. Gabriella, in turn, continued her work at the NGO. She transformed lives with the same firmness with which she transformed his. And Arthur, who had given so many interviews, refused so many exhibitions, accepted a single invitation to a conversation circle among survivors of emotional violence. He spoke for a few minutes. He told about the silence, the fear, the body trapped in a bed, and about how the first blink, the one Gabriella understood, was the loudest scream he had ever given in his life. When he finished, everyone was silent, and he simply said, "Life can almost kill us, but as long as someone sees our pain, there is still hope." And that day, he planted another seed. Truly, the life Arthur led now was not perfect. There were difficult days, existential crises, memories that came back uninvited, but he learned not to run away from it anymore. He learned that courage is not the absence of fear, it is action despite it. And perhaps that is why he became a more complete man than ever before. His name still circulated in some circles, especially among readers who had been moved by his book, or people who were touched by the social projects he supported. But he no longer clung to that. It was as if he had stopped being the Arthur, the powerful businessman, to become just Arthur, and that was liberating. Gabriella said that loving someone is recognizing their shadows and still remaining, and that's what they did for each other. During a simple dinner at home, while sharing a cheap wine and laughing at some memory, Arthur stopped for a moment and looked at her with a peaceful gleam in his eyes. "Do you know what I'm most grateful for?" he asked. Gabriella looked up, curious. "For having survived?" she ventured. And he shook his head. "No, for having woken up. Because there are people who live a whole life without truly waking up." She smiled, touching his face affectionately. "You woke up when everyone thought you were leaving." And they both laughed, with the kind of laughter that only those who have been close to the end are capable of giving. A laughter that celebrates the now. The night continued calmly, like so many others that were yet to come. Because for those who have been between life and death, every simple moment is a miracle. And Arthur, after everything, no longer wanted grandeur. He just wanted this: to live with truth, to love with wholeness, and to sleep with a clear conscience. The years passed with a gentleness that Arthur never imagined he could experience, and the more time advanced, the more he realized that the real triumph was not being alive. It was knowing what to do with that life. There wasn't a day when he didn't think, even if just for a second, about everything he experienced in that hospital, the suffocating silence of the coma, the pain of hearing betrayals without being able to react. But now, those memories no longer hurt him. They were like scars that, although visible, no longer hurt to the touch. One winter afternoon, he and Gabriella received a visit from a young woman. She arrived timidly, holding a copy of the book. I was almost silenced. Her eyes were teary, her hands trembling. She said that Arthur's story had stopped her from giving up on her own life, that she recognized, in his account, the signs of the abusive relationship she was living in, that she got out in time. Arthur listened to everything attentively, without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't say any catchy phrases. He just hugged her, tightly, and in that gesture, she understood everything. Gabriella, on the side, watched with teary eyes. That was what they valued most, transforming pain into a bridge. It was for moments like that that they continued. After she left, Gabriella commented, "We'll never know how many people you saved with your courage." And Arthur replied, "I also don't know how many lives you saved by listening to me." That conversation lingered for a long time, even after the silence returned, because in the end, what they built was not just a fresh start. It was a testimony that it is possible to go through the worst and still choose not to become like what tried to destroy you. And that, Arthur knew well, was the greatest kind of strength someone could have. In that mature phase of life, Arthur began to value the idea of legacy, but not in the traditional sense of inheritance or fame. What he wanted to leave behind was an idea, a trace of truth, something that, even after his departure, could touch someone. He began to write a second book, this time more intimate, almost like a diary, where he recounted what he learned about trust, fear, fresh starts, and above all, listening. He called it After the Silence. He didn't expect to launch it on a large scale nor to profit from it. It was more of an offering, a way to give back to the world what he received in the most fragile moment of his existence. Gabriella followed each chapter with attentive eyes and an open heart. Sometimes, she suggested changes. Other times, she cried in silence. It was a project of both of them, even if his name was on the cover. One morning, during a light walk along the trail near the house where they lived, Arthur stopped and stared at the horizon. It was autumn. The leaves fell with elegance, as if nature itself understood the importance of letting go. He turned to Gabriella and said, "If I leave tomorrow, I would already be at peace." She held his hand tightly. "But you won't. There are still many people to hear this story." He smiled, not like someone who denies death, but like someone who has made peace with it. Because after everything, Arthur understood that time is a fragile gift, and that living, truly, is having the courage to feel, even if it hurts, even if it wounds, even if it almost kills you, because that's where we find what really matters. And he, after everything, had found it, in Gabriella, in himself, and in the daily choice to remain human in a world that so often tries to harden us. In the months leading up to finishing his new book, Arthur felt something change within him. It wasn't illness, nor sadness. It was a type of serenity that only comes to those who have made peace with everything. With the past, with the mistakes, with the silences. He started waking up earlier, just to watch the sun rise from the balcony. He would, make coffee before Gabriella got up, letting the aroma fill the house, and sit there quietly with a notebook in his lap. He wrote not to publish, but to remember. Everything he had lived through, everything he had overcome. One day, he wrote a sentence that Gabriella found by chance among his notes. Life crushed me, but taught me to recompose myself into truer pieces. And that was exactly it. He was no longer the same Arthur from the past, no longer the arrogant businessman, the distracted husband, the man who thought he could control everything. Now, he was just a man, whole in his imperfection. Gabriella, who never sought the spotlight, became his informal editor, his advisor, his calm. They didn't need ceremonies or dates to celebrate the love they had built. Each day lived with respect, and lightness was a celebration. One of those mornings, he looked at her while she was reading in the hammock, barefoot, with her hair carelessly tied up, and thought, I almost died without, knowing what it was like to truly love someone. And he smiled, not because he was happy, but because he was at peace. Peace is different from happiness. Peace is knowing that you lived everything you could live, with your whole soul, that you chose to remain good, even after everything. And that's what he did. He survived the worst and didn't lose the best of himself, his humanity, his capacity to feel, his will to continue. Arthur died years later, at home in his sleep. It was a peaceful, serene death, the kind that few have the privilege of experiencing. No pain, no hospital, no tubes or urgent goodbyes. Gabriella was by his side, as she always had been. She found him the next morning, with a calm face, his fingers intertwined with hers. She didn't cry right away. She stayed there for hours, holding his hand, as she had done in the first days in the hospital, when he was still trapped in his own body. The difference was that now, there was no fear, only gratitude. She took care of everything with the same delicacy that he would have asked for. A simple burial with few people, instrumental music in the background, and a letter read at the end of the ceremony. I lived, really. I lived with pain, but also with courage. I was betrayed, but I never stopped trusting. I fell, but I got up more whole. And above all, I loved, with everything I had, and because of that, I can go in peace. When Gabriella finished reading, there was silence, a beautiful silence, the kind that doesn't require words. She returned home that night, sat on the same porch where so many coffees had been drunk, and opened his notebook. There, among so many notes, was one last sentence, written in shaky handwriting, as if it were a final whisper. If I can leave anything in this world, let it be this, the memory that someone chose to live truthfully, even when everything said otherwise. She closed the notebook carefully, placed it on her chest, and took a deep breath. Life would go on, with Numo, longing, with memory, with strength, because the love that is born of truth never dies. Arthur was gone, but his story remained, and whoever heard it, whoever felt it, would never be the same again. Because some stories change the world, even if it is just one person's world.